Alright, how many companions do you think we can kill in one round of combat? Oh, whoops, I didn't even start stealthed. Oh well, let's shoot Jaheira first. She's wounded for some reason, that's okay. We'll get her with an offhand, I think. Down goes Jaheira. Let's see if we can get Minsk next. He's got 116 health, so this could be a little harder. Ooh. Oh, he lived! Alright, let's get him with an offhand. We missed! Again! Alright, let's get Minsk and Will if we can. I think I have to move over a little bit. Disadvantage. Oh, because I moved next to Boo. Down goes Minsk. Still can't use sneak attack because I forgot to start stealth. That's fine. Let's see if we can take Will out. One more shot. Maybe that ought to do it. Down goes Will. Alright. Let's see if we can get anybody else. Can we get Halcyon too? Only if we get a little lucky, but maybe we can. Alright. Show me critical. Critical hit, please. Ah, Halcyon lived with 17. Alright, well, we only got 3.5 companions in one round of combat. That's with a couple misses. Also, just to point out, we've got almost no items on this character. So, yeah, that's the build. See you in a second. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 build guide. Hope you're all doing well. So, you normally wouldn't think of a bard as a damage-dealing class. They're a quintessential support character, or fifth man, that's sort of intended to round out a party. Well, I'm here to tell you, not this bard. This bard does ridiculous damage. I believe we're going to end up tied for the most ranged attacks that you can make in a single round of combat, and each of those will be doing incredible damage individually as well. This character also, of course, gets all of the skills, spells, and out-of-combat utility that come with being a bard, as well as dealing some of the highest damage output in the game. This character, I think, is an excellent main character because you're going to have great access to dialogue skills and utility spells, and also will fit in any party, and is actually, I think, one of the most powerful character options as well for soloing Tactician mode if that's something that you're interested in doing, because you're a stealth ranged attacker, so you're going to be able to solve most encounters from range without the enemies ever knowing that you were there. Let's dive right in and get to building. So, of course, the first thing that you will notice is that we are using the Wood Half-Elf Hireling. I think that this is the optimal race for this build for two reasons. One, of course, is that all Wood Elf variants are incredible because the bonus move speed is really good, especially for a ranged attacker who wants to stay out of combat range as much as possible, out of melee range as much as possible. And second, because Wood Half-Elves get shield proficiency, which we won't otherwise pick up during the build, and shield proficiency is even more valuable for ranged characters than melee characters in this game because you can still have two ranged weapons or a two-handed ranged weapon equipped and gain the AC benefits of a shield at the same time. So it's very important to get shield proficiency on every ranged character. We also, of course, will need to fix our starting stats, so let's do that. And as a dexterity-based ranged attacker, we're actually going to take a slightly unusual stat split for Bard. We are not going to boost our charisma to maximum, but instead going to focus on dexterity and constitution. Want these both at 16. And then we'll take 14 in charisma to ensure that we can still cast our bard spells reasonably effectively, and our remaining 4 points will go into wisdom. If you're taking Anti-Ethel's Deal to increase your dexterity by 1, you could take 17 dexterity and 10 wisdom, and then use that to boost your dexterity to 18. That would save you a feat later down the line. If you don't know what that means, it's a spoiler for later, so don't worry about it yet. But you can also respec into that stat split when you do that. This is the optimal starting stat split. I will also show you a second version of the build that relies on an item for dexterity and ends up getting more feats overall and gets to actually defer somewhat significantly from the primary version of the build, but this build is going to be completely item agnostic, which is really nice because then you don't need to rely on finding specific items in order to reach the extremely powerful heights that this build will get you to. For our skill selection, the only really important one is that you have stealth, and of course you're a bard, so you'll probably be the party face. You're going to want at least some points in your dialogue skills. If you are a wood half-elf, as I recommend, you will also get stealth from your racial proficiency. My suggestion is that performance, despite being a bard, actually does not come up that often in the game, and you will most likely want to move that skill point into sleight of hand early on. Because sleight of hand, you're a dexterity-based character, so you'll be good at picking locks, and sleight of hand gives you, as a main character, a lot of utility, lets you avoid taking a rogue in your party if that's not something you want to do. Of course, this is all going to depend on what you have in your party, and whether you're actually doing the conversation, but this is the recommended skill spread that I would go with. For our cantrip selection, there are really two that matter a lot for this build, so I highly recommend having Minor Illusion and Mage Hand both. Minor Illusion is really good for these stealth-based ranged attackers, because you can group up enemies or put them in awkward situations, get them out of areas that are well lit to make sure that you are able to stealth on them. Extremely powerful, and Mage Hand gives you just a ton of out-of-combat utility, so it's very useful. If you have that from elsewhere in your party, of course, you could take Blade Ward or Friends, giving you a little bit of extra utility, but for the most part, I think these two are going to serve you the best. We avoid taking Vicious Mockery because all of our attacks are just going to be hand crossbow attacks rather than cantrips, so we don't need to have this, and it would have a low DC from our low charisma anyways. For your spell selection, of course, there are a few spells that really stand out as utility spells for bards early on, and we're going to take all of them. Again, you want to avoid things that have a spell DC, because your charisma is going to be low, so your spell DCs will be low. So you want spells that are utility spells, specifically out-of-combat utility spells, and not spells that require saves. The best ones here are going to be Longstrider. This is a ritual, meaning it does not cost you a spell slot to cast, and just gives you 10 feet of bonus movement speed for the entire day. I already talked about how good movement speed is, and it's incredibly valuable for this build, so you definitely want Longstrider. Healing Word gives you a bonus action option to heal, which is very good as well. And then for the remaining two, they are less important, but I like having Disguise Self, just because it comes up a ton in dialogue checks. For any main character, this is going to be really valuable. And Featherfall can give you some utility. You could take Fairy Fire. It does allow a save, but if they do fail the save, then it's very useful. Sleep has no save at early levels, so it's still a really good combat spell even at very early levels, and in fact, if you're playing this character from level 1, I would suggest taking Sleep, and then we'll swap that out later on. Alright, that is our level 1 spell selection, and the character is set up. Let's keep on going. At level 2, we get an additional spell, so we're just going to take any utility spell that we think is going to be useful, something like Featherfall, Speak with Animals. Speak with Animals is also really nice to have, so I would definitely pick this up if you're the party face. And at this point, you can even potentially replace Sleep. It will still be somewhat useful at level 2, but already the enemies are going to have too much health for it to affect them. One thing that is really important about this build is that we now get access to Song of Rest, which basically gives you a third short rest every day. This character is going to operate primarily on short rests as its resource, because starting at level 5, your Bardic Inspiration dice will come back on a short rest, and Song of Rest giving you additional of these means that you are going to have access to the main combo of your character more often during the day. So this is a really important thing to have access to. Bard level 3, of course, we need to pick our college, and I've gone on record as saying that College of Lore is the best college, but of course for this build, because we are doing damage, we are going to take College of Swords. This gives you two things that are really important for this build. One, it gives you a fighting style, and because we are going to be using 2 hand crossbows as our weapons of choice, the fighting style that we're going to select is 2-weapon fighting. This lets our offhand attacks with our second-hand crossbow also apply our dexterity to them, which is incredibly strong. It means that we are going to be dealing basically full damage with both of these weapons. This used to be bugged before. I know I'm going to get comments about this. It used to be bugged and apply your dexterity to the offhand hand crossbow without 2-weapon fighting. They fixed that, so you do need this fighting style. And, of course, the other thing that the College of Swords gets is access to these flourishes. This looks like a lot of buttons, but we could ignore the melee ones, because we're fighting primarily at ranged anyways. And in fact, there's only one that we really care about, and that is Slashing Flourish. The thing that Slashing Flourish does that is interesting is that it allows you to attack 2 enemies at once, but the tooltip does not make clear that this can be the same enemy. So for a Bardic Inspiration die, you basically just get a second attack, which means that you are one of the very few characters who can do multiple main hand attacks starting at level 3. Only otherwise Berserker Barbarians, War Clerics, I guess, can a couple times a day, but for the most part, your characters will not be able to do multiple attacks starting at 3rd level. You get access to this right off the bat at 3rd level, where you can attack now 3 times around, including the full damage of your offhand weapon. This is already a ridiculous number of attacks, and it only gets better as we get access to more attacks. It also adds your inspiration die to your damage for this, which is nice, just a nice little bonus. This won't end up being incredibly relevant, but it does add quite a bit to your damage when you're making a ton of attacks overall. For our spell selection here, starting at level 2, level 2 actually normally for bards has a lot of spells. A lot of the good spells have save DCs, so you want to avoid ones that have save DCs. My advice is you can take Invisibility. There's a lot of utility just for having that. You can take Cloud of Daggers, which has no save DC and does give you a little AoE damage, which is always nice to have access to, though again, most of the time this character is just going to want to be shooting in order to get that damage output. But either of those is good. I'm going to suggest taking Invisibility here. We will also, at this point, swap out Sleep for the other one of those two, since Sleep now no longer is going to put any enemies to sleep because they'll have higher health than its maximum. As we continue to level up, we get a feat, and there are actually 2 good choices for feats at this level, and it depends on how reliably you think you are going to be able to trigger advantage on this character, and how reliably your other characters can support it. If you are, for example, in a party with a cleric that has Bless and can make your hit chances better, and if you can reliably hide and trigger advantage, you could, starting at level 4, take Sharpshooter already. The -5 penalty to your attack rolls is huge at this level, and definitely makes you less likely to hit, but +10 damage, of course, is incredible at level 4, and remember that you're doing this 3 times a turn, meaning that this is going to be an average of +30 damage, or not an average, but this is going to add +30 possible damage to every single turn of combat, until you run out of Slashing Flourishes. The reason that you need to be with an ally who has access to Bless, or have a bunch of other ways to increase your hit chance, of course, is that otherwise your hit chance penalty will be too high, but if you do have those, then you should definitely take Sharpshooter early. If you don't, and I think a reasonable default for most players is just going to be to take an ability improvement and increase our dexterity. This increases the damage of our main and offhand attacks, and is incredibly powerful, of course, and just important for being able to hit things as well. We also get an additional cantrip, so take whichever one you're kind of missing. Once again, as I so often do, I'm going to take True Strike just to annoy people in the comments. For our level 2 spell selection, we're going to continue with the theme of taking things that don't have saves and select Silence. This is not incredible in Baldur's Gate 3 often because enemies can just walk out of it usually, but if there's a way that you can find to keep an enemy inside it, it of course shuts down a spellcaster completely, and there's a couple encounters that it's particularly strong for, so it's worth having access to, just as a solid utility spell. Bard level 5, we get 2 really important things, one of which is Font of Inspiration, giving us back our inspiration dice on a short rest. Remember that we're spending an inspiration die every time we want to use Slashing Flourish, so getting these back on a short rest means that we can do this many, many more times per day. And the bonus damage goes up to 1d8, which is pretty nice as well. For our spell selection, we are again looking for things that don't have saves associated with them. So my pick here, because it is not concentration and doesn't have a save, and you are a ranged attacker, is probably going to be Plant Growth. This creates a 40-foot radius area where enemies move at 1/4 speed, and as a ranged attacker, it's pretty nice to be able to prevent melee enemies from getting to you easily. This is especially useful against some enemies that can't jump. And while it's worse for this character than other ranged attackers because hand crossbows have lower range, it's still very valuable against some enemies, some melee enemies in particular, and will stop them from being able to ever reach you. If you don't like Plant Growth, there's a couple other options, but honestly, at level 3, when you aren't taking things that have save DCs, the picks are a little bit fewer and further between, so I recommend using Plant Growth. Finally, at Bard level 6, the Sword Bard gets the other thing that makes it incredibly good, and that is Extra Attack. This is 1 level later than many other classes reach their Extra Attack, but we need to go to Bard level 5 at least in order to get the short rest refresh on our Inspiration dice, so we might as well take Bard level 6 to get Extra Attack before we even consider multi-classing. Extra Attack is going to let us use Slashing Flourish again, meaning that now in a round of combat where we spend 2 Slashing Flourishes, we get 5 attacks, because each of those attack actions is worth 2 attacks each. That's obviously super strong and means that we are now doing more damage than most other characters at this point in the game, just by virtue of sheer number of attacks. You also get Counter Charm, which basically doesn't matter at all, but is useful if you know you're going to be against an enemy with Charm or Fear. For our spell selection here, at this point you will probably know what you're missing. You could take a utility spell like Lesser Restoration or Featherfall. Again, just take things that you think you will actually cast, and try to avoid things that you think you won't. Bard level 7 gets us access to 4th level spells, which is particularly powerful for this character because, unlike most bardic characters, we actually don't concentrate on spells particularly often, because we're not using Hypnotic Pattern, we're not using Fear, we're not using Fairy Fire, and so bards usually have really important uses for their concentration, but they're all save DC based. This character actually has no such restriction, and can thus concentrate on a spell that is very, very strong if you are a damage-dealing character, Greater Invisibility. The stealth checks for this get increasingly difficult, but you do get a bonus on stealth, and you get advantage on all your attacks, which means that when we have Sharpshooter, you're going to be able to land your attacks much more reliably. Now, you attack so often that you will not be able to maintain Greater Invisibility throughout like multiple rounds of combat, or even probably throughout your first round of combat, but the advantage it gives you for those first few rounds of attacks is so strong, and landing attacks is something that this build can actually struggle with, so it's really nice to be able to do that. Finally, we take Bard level 8, getting access to a second feat, and at this point we definitely, if we don't have it already, need to take Sharpshooter. It's also worth mentioning that one thing you might be wondering about is why are we not taking Crossbow Expert? You know, it's got crossbow in the name, and we're using hand crossbows. And the reason is just that you can just walk away. Like, you'd rather just take the attack of opportunity, and then later on we'll get ways even to avoid that, than spend an entire feat on making melee range attacks without disadvantage. You can just walk away from the enemy, take the attack of opportunity, and then shoot them. So, Crossbow Expert, while it does sound like it's going to be good, isn't particularly valuable for this build. For our second spell here, you could take something like Freedom of Movement. Again, this gives you an until long rest buff that you can cast on yourself, and it stops you from being paralyzed or restrained. Obviously, those are two of the worst things that can possibly happen to you, especially if you're solo. So getting access to Freedom of Movement for a solo character, it lasts all day and prevents some of the worst possible effects that can hit you in this game. It's very useful to be able to do that. At this point, we've gotten pretty much everything we need out of Bard, and so we definitely want to be able to increase our damage output and gain some additional utility, which we can do by multi-classing. The class that we're going to pick here, because we're making these offhand attacks, and we're attacking from stealth at range very frequently, of course, is Rogue. Rogue will get us access to 2 expertises, which we can spend one of on stealth, meaning that we are less likely to fail our stealth checks, as well as an additional skill, which is always useful. I recommend definitely taking these expertise points in stealth and sleight of hand. You could even take this rogue level earlier if you really want these access to these skill expertises earlier, but overall, I think, in general, you're going to want to max out your Bard and get access to Sharpshooter as soon as possible, so I recommend taking Rogue levels nearer the end, but that's definitely something to consider if you want these skills earlier. You also, of course, get Sneak Attack, increasing your damage slightly, though Sneak Attack at this point is not going to be a significant component of your damage output, because remember, we are doing minimum 5 attacks on a turn where we're spending resources, and so the 1d6 of extra Sneak Attack damage is going to be a tiny fraction of our overall damage output. At level 2, though, we get something that's pretty nice for this build, which is Cunning Action Hide, allowing you to re-hide. It does cost you your offhand attack, but sometimes you'd rather have advantage than the offhand attack, as well as Cunning Action Disengage, which allows you to move safely away from opportunity attacks. Again, this costs you your offhand attack, but being able to disengage safely from enemies and then still attack 4 times with your main hand weapon is really, really strong, and one of the reasons we don't need Crossbow Expert for this build. Finally, at Rogue level 3, we get the whole reason to do this, which is Thief, the Thief subclass, which gets you an additional bonus action, bringing our number of attacks per turn from 5 to 6, increasing our damage output significantly, as well as giving us a lot of utility just from having the second bonus action. Now you can hide, fire an attack, hide again, fire an attack, gaining advantage on both of those Slashing Flourish attacks. The Slashing Flourish attacks are also made simultaneously, it's worth mentioning, so if you're hidden for the first one, you'll get advantage on both of those Slashing Flourish attacks, because they happen at the same time. So unlike other characters that multi-attack, hiding will always give you advantage on at least 2 attacks for this build, even if you then are subsequently caught and fail your stealth check. Going up, of course, to... don't need to add a new class. Going up to 6 attacks per round means that we are doing just tons of damage, and of course we can increase that further with items or buffs from an ally. Finally, at the last level, we're going to max out our dexterity, meaning that we have +5 dex, giving us very solid initiative, great damage on every attack, so with Sharpshooter and 20 dexterity, attacking 6 times per round. If you hit with all of those attacks, that's a minimum of 90 damage before you do any additional things from the damage dice of your Slashing Flourish, the damage dice of your weapons, the additional damage that you might be doing based on what weapon you fire. So your average damage, once you take all that sort of thing into account, is going to be somewhere in the 160 to 180 mark, putting you comfortably over top of the almost every other build in the game in terms of damage per round on a burst damage turn. Another thing that's worth mentioning with this build is you get excellent AC as well, because you will have medium armor access. So any of the medium armors that increase your AC or allow you to apply your full dexterity bonus to AC are going to work very well with your +5 dexterity. So you'll actually have better armor class than a character that uses heavy armor. And you get to apply your full shield bonus even when you are using 2 ranged weapons in your main and offhand, because you can get the benefit of shields even with a ranged weapon equipped. I'll talk a little bit more about itemization as well once I show you the second version of the build, but the important thing basically is just to find the best hand crossbows that you can. Obviously, the more damage these do, the more damage you're going to do overall. Alright, so you might be wondering, well, this build is pretty feat-starved. What if we used the Gloves of Dexterity? And the answer to that is that that's very good, and we can actually do a ton of additional work with the Gloves of Dexterity. So let's do a version of the build that uses those, because we actually get to rejig the entire build to be even more powerful. We still start with Bard, but of course we're going to take a slightly different stat split because we no longer need Dexterity. You will want to respec into this stat split later in the game, of course, but we get to increase our Charisma up to 16, boost our Wisdom to 14 for better saving throws, and then take 12 Strength, giving us access to a little more shove chance as well as jump distance, which is pretty good for a Thief Rogue as well, because the bonus action, the second bonus action lets you jump, of course. We'll make basically the same spell selection, although with this version of the build you're going to have slightly better charisma, so you can consider taking spells with save DCs. Overall, though, I generally wouldn't. I'm just going to speed through this really quick because I've showed you most of the choices that we've made already. Take additional spells, and of course we take the College of Swords, gaining access to the 2-weapon fighting style. For our first feat, and in fact the only feat that this build will get, we're going to take Sharpshooter, because we are actually not going to reach level 4 in any other class for the rest of this build, so we take Sharpshooter. We don't need the ability score increases because we're using the Gloves of Dexterity, which gives you the same attack bonus as having 20 Dexterity, because it sets your Dex to 18 and gives you +1 attack. Also just have to pick some spells here, so we'll take random ones just to speed through the level up process. At Bard level 6, we get access to extra attack, meaning that we can stop leveling up in Bard, since we now have everything we really need from Swords Bard. The downside, of course, of this version of the build is you don't get access to greater invisibility, you don't get access to freedom of movement, but you're going to do way more damage, so, you know, your mileage may vary as to whether you think that's important. We now go immediately into our rogue levels, gaining access to sneak attack, as well as getting to our second offhand attack as quickly as possible. Luckily, no decisions to make here in the Thief Rogue section of the build. And then, finally, we are going to add in levels in Fighter. Fighter gets you access, of course, to an additional fighting style, the archery fighting style, which helps offset the hit penalty of having lower dexterity, as well as the hit penalty of sharpshooter, meaning that this version of the build actually has slightly better hit chance overall than the other version of the build, despite only reaching 18 dexterity in the at the end game. And of course, at level 2 fighter, we get Action Surge. Every action is an additional 2 attacks for us, and every 2 attacks is an additional 4 attacks thanks to Slashing Flourish. So this version of the build can fire off in a single round of combat 10 attacks before gaining access to haste or the Elixir of Bloodlust, anything along those lines. 10 attacks, of course, is 100 sharpshooter damage, plus an additional 40 damage just from your dexterity, plus all of the damage dealt by your slashing flourishes, by the damage of your attacks. Now, you won't be able actually to slashing flourish every round of combat. I think we're going to end up with... No, we'll end up with 4 inspiration dice, so you should be able to fire off 8 slashing flourish attacks total in your first round of combat. You'll then be out of inspiration dice and need to short rest, but if you need more than 10 attacks to make your way through a round of combat, you it's probably a pretty rare round of combat, and so you are going to also be able to use other buffs in order to accomplish that. For our final level up, you have two choices. You can either take Battle Master or you can take Champion. Champion, of course, increases our chance to critically hit, meaning that the average damage of our attacks goes up somewhat. I still prefer taking Battle Master, though. Even though you cannot use a maneuver and a flourish on the same attack, other than precise attack, precision attack is still very valuable to guarantee that certain important attacks hit, and this also gives you just a little more sustain when you don't want to spend your inspiration dice on attacks. You still have interesting and valuable things that you can do in combat, including Disarming Strike and Menacing Attack. Those two are better for the ranged version of the build. Menacing Attack in particular is really nice because it's going to frighten the enemy, stopping them from moving, meaning that you are able to continue to attack them. Frightened enemies have disadvantage on all of their stuff, but most importantly, they can't move, meaning that if you frighten an enemy, you can then switch your focus to something else and guarantee that that melee enemy will not reach you in combat, and Disarming Attack just has a lot of utility as well. Alright, my friends, so let's take a quick look at items, and this build actually is very item independent, although there's a couple that are worth mentioning. Of course, we need the Gloves of Dexterity for this version of the build, setting our dex to 18. We still end up with 23 armor class compared to the 24 of the other build, but it's just overall going to make more attacks, so that's a worthy trade-off, I think. And some other things that are really worth mentioning are this build, because each action is worth so many attacks, you benefit very strongly from things like Potions of Speed, or the haste from an ally, as well as the Elixir of Bloodlust being incredibly strong because that will get you additional actions as well. The more actions that you take, of course, the more attacks you can make, and the theoretical maximum number of attacks that you can reach in a turn with this build, I believe, is 16 with a single action from the Elixir of Bloodlust. My math on that might be slightly off, but I think you do 8 attacks from Bardic Inspiration flourishes, then 2 offhand attacks, then 2 more attacks from your haste action, and then 2 more attacks from your Bloodlust action at minimum, giving you 16 attacks in a single round. Nothing is going to survive that long. 16 attacks is way more than you're going to need, but that is what you will reach if you aspire to the heights of this build. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at the Machine Gun Bard, and as always, if you have, do please feel free to leave a comment, like the video, both of those help a ton with the algorithm, and you can subscribe to my channel for more of this and other strategy game content. Cheers, my friends, and I'll catch you next time.